Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I am Leslie Gentarosmi, the Managing Director of the Energy Program at the Bipartisan Policy Center and staff lead for BPC's Farm and Forest Carbon Solutions Task Force. The task force came together earlier this year to advance more innovative federal farm, forest, and climate policies. And over the past months, we've been developing a roadmap for scaling investments in land-based carbon storage and emissions reductions, ensuring the high integrity of these solutions and reducing barriers to voluntary stewardship practices. The task force recently released 5 policy priority areas for natural climate solutions investments, and I am thrilled to introduce our guests today to speak more about these issues. Moderating the discussion today is Senator Saxby Chambliss, who is co-chair of BPC's task force. He is a partner in the DLA Piper Global Law Firm and served in the US Senate for 2 terms and served 4 terms in the US House of Representatives. And during his tenure in the Senate, Senator Chambliss served as a member of the Senate Armed Forces Committee, the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry, the Senate Rules Committee, and the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, where he was also the vice chairman from 2011 to 2015. Also moderating today's discussion is Senator Heidi Heitkamp, who served as the first female senator elected from North Dakota from 2013 to 2019. Senator Heitkamp previously served as North Dakota's Attorney General and elected state tax commissioner. She is the founder and chair of the One Country Project, an organization focused on addressing the needs and concerns of rural America. Senator Heitkamp serves as a contributor to both CNBC and ABC News. And joining them is Congressman Joe Neguse, who represents Colorado's 2nd District in the US House of Representatives. And prior to this, served in the governor of Colorado's cabinet as the executive director of Colorado's Consumer Protection Agency. He was elected to his first term in November of 2018, becoming the first African-American member of Congress in Colorado's history. And among other appointments, Congressman Neguse serves as a member of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis and the House Natural Resources Committee, where he chairs the subcommittee on national parks, forests, and public lands. He is also co-founder and chair of the Bipartisan Wildfire Caucus, and his public service is rooted in the firm belief that we should be expanding and not restricting opportunities for all Americans, where he has spent his career doing just that. So I will turn it over to the senators for this conversation, and just wanted to remind our audience, you can tweet at us using the hashtag BPC Live, and our Twitter is at BPC_bipartisan for asking questions during the Q&A portion. Thank you all so much.
Well, thank you, Leslie, and thanks to all of you for tuning in today. And Congressman, we appreciate really you taking the time to visit with us today. And also just want to thank you for the great work that you're doing in the House on the issue of wildfires, and particularly the relative of import of wildfires in the issue of climate change. You know, we have all witnessed the dramatic wildfires burning across the western United States in years, and the extraordinary damage to property, habitat, and in some cases, human life. Congressman, early this year, you launched the Bipartisan Wildfire Caucus alongside Congressman John Curtis from Utah. What led you to take on this leadership role in the addressing of wildfires? And have you seen particularly damaging or frequent fires in your congressional district there in Colorado and the northern central area of Colorado?
Yes. So first and foremost, thank you all so much to the Bipartisan Center for hosting this great conversation, and of course to Senator Chambliss and Senator Heitkamp. Certainly an honor and a privilege to be able to join you all to talk a little bit about this important issue. I can remember being in law school 15 years ago, following both of you and your respective careers in the United States Senate, and it certainly is a privilege to be able to talk with you today. I represent, as you mentioned, Senator, a district that is pretty large. It's a central northern Colorado district that stretches all the way up to the Wyoming border. It is larger than the state of New Jersey, just by way of context. Of course, I know you both come from big states as well. And 52% of my district is federal public lands. We have some of the most iconic public lands in our country right here in Colorado's 2nd District: Rocky Mountain National Park, of course, Arapahoe Roosevelt National Forest, White River National Forest, which is the most traveled and visited national forest in the entire country by virtue of the ski resorts that it is home to: Vail, Breckenridge, and others. And last year, we've never been a stranger to wildfire, right? Wildfire has always been an issue here in the Rocky Mountain West and in Colorado, and certainly my district is no exception. But last year was a particularly problematic year for us and for our communities. We had the first and second largest wildfires in the history of Colorado, 137 years. Both happened simultaneously in my congressional district. At one point, both of these fires were only a few miles away from each other. They burned hundreds of thousands of acres across our communities. They destroyed many homes, many businesses, and tragically, several of my constituents lost their lives, in particular in the East Troublesome Fire, which was a fire up in Grand County in that part of our community. And those two wildfires really were a wake-up call for certainly our communities, and I think in particular for our policymakers, that the reality is wildfires are here to stay as a result of climate change, the drought conditions that are exacerbating these fires and really converting wildfires into mega fires, right? The intensity of these fires, the scale, the pervasiveness is just something that we aren't accustomed to. And unfortunately, I think that it is likely to become the rule and not the exception in years to come, which means the policymakers have got to get serious about doing everything we can to build out resiliency, mitigation, and take these wildfires seriously, right? And recognizing the gravity of the crisis that we face. So that is really what led me to kind of make wildfire preparedness and wildfire resiliency a core focus of my time in Congress. And the Wildfire Caucus that you mentioned, the Bipartisan Caucus, which myself and my colleague from Utah, John Curtis, who's a Republican from the state of Utah, represents a district that's pretty similar to mine in terms of its public lands components. He represents Park City, Utah. He'll say he has better skiing in his district. I, of course, disagree. But him and I, both kind of had a number of conversations last year as our states were experiencing these wildfires, and the reality that the wildfires don't discriminate based on political jurisdiction or municipal lines, right? They don't care about whether your community is a Republican community or a Democratic community. They're going to impact every community equally, which means that our solutions ought not be divided by political party either. And so him and I came together to create this caucus. We have one rule only. It's a simple rule, which is that you can only join the caucus if you come into the caucus with a member of the opposing political party. It has kept the caucus pretty small, unfortunately. We've got about 14 people in it. But, honestly, it's also kept the caucus, I think, more committed to the fidelity of the sort of mission of the caucus, which is to try to work in a bipartisan fashion to craft solutions that will ultimately address this problem for the benefit of our constituents. So that's really how we came up with it.
Congressman, you talk a lot about resiliency and what's happening, but there isn't a part of the country that hasn't been affected. North Dakota is not a state that's well known for trees, unlike your district, but yet we saw football games almost being canceled because of particulates in the air and because of forest fires. We saw, air quality problems in the southeastern corner where it was flashing red because of forest fires. And so there isn't any part of the country, even those parts that don't have a lot of trees, that aren't affected. We know from polling that not a lot of people really know what's in the Build Back Better, the infrastructure plan. And so this is your chance to talk about what currently is being considered and what additional measures you would take to build resiliency in America's forests and to respond to the climate crisis as it relates to your district, but also places like North Dakota.
Sure. Well, I will say we've had a great partner in Kelly Armstrong, who's a representative for North Dakota and a dear friend of mine, who we've partnered with on some of these issues, notwithstanding that North Dakota doesn't have as many trees as northern Colorado, as you said, Senator. But I agree with you. The infrastructure bill, the bipartisan infrastructure deal, and the Build Back Better plan, both of which I think include provisions that would inure to the benefit of the American people in building out infrastructure across the country, including public lands infrastructure, which is such a key component of this wildfire resiliency discussion. They are not necessarily as well understood by the public, unfortunately, and perhaps that's kind of the 24/7 media environment that we live in now, with short attention spans. But I relish the opportunity to talk a little bit about the detail of both of these bills, because I do think they'll have a transformative impact on our communities. Just to give you a couple of examples in the context of wildfire resiliency, the bipartisan infrastructure deal includes a bill, a provision that I worked on with Senator Michael Bennet, who of course you both served with, on authorizing a program that is managed by USDA, the Joint Chiefs Landscape Reauthorization Program, a really effective program that essentially brings together private and public parties, right? So a kind of collaboration at its best around lands that really require some intense and laborious work to ultimately ensure that there's mitigation within the system, right? So that can extend to reforestation. It can extend to clearing out some of the fuels that are in these particular areas that are providing a potential, could become very problematic, right, given the circumstances, to also doing some wildlife habitat preservation work and some watershed mitigation and protection work. So that program will be authorized as by virtue of the infrastructure bill, were that bill to get to the president's desk for his signature, which I have every expectation it will. So a good example of a program that hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but that would benefit the landowners, the communities, the counties, the municipalities, and ultimately the states that are grappling with this issue from a public lands management perspective. The reconciliation bill, the Build Back Better bill, again, just another sort of different side of the same coin. The Climate Conservation Corps, which President Biden has envisioned, and which me and Senator Wyden, Senator Coons, Senator Markey have been working on for the better part of the last year and a half, would be included within the Build Back Better framework, a down payment of sorts that would employ hundreds of thousands of folks in our public lands, addressing some of the deferred maintenance and the backlog that exists. And again, really laborious, intensive work. I cannot begin to tell you how many landowners, how many homeowners in my district, right, have incredibly thorough and robust projects that are just in need of funding and of people to help work them, right, to clear out some of those fuels and to build out more resiliency so that when the next big fire comes, we know that they, and by extension, our communities will be protected, and the Climate Conservation Corps would address that need. So 2 examples. There's a lot more within both bills that would help, I think, rural America fire-wise, a really important program that goes to small cities and counties to better prepare for wildfire. So grants that could really make a huge world of difference in the smaller communities that I represent that don't have the tax base to support those kinds of investments. So I think on balance, a lot of good programs that I'm hopeful we can get across the finish line.
Congressman, I hope that some of your Southeastern colleagues are joining that wildfire caucus. We don't have the expanse of federal lands, but we have wildfires from time to time, primarily on private lands. And we are able to keep our fuel under control, and by burning as well as thinning those types of things that have been advantageous in the southeastern part of the country with respect to controlling the wildfire. So I hope that some of my friends will join you and help promote the resources that y'all need as well as we need in the southeastern part of the country. Throughout the western U.S., that the fire season has increasingly become fire years versus fire seasons. Given this kind of devastation, including for states like Colorado, Do you really think that the tools and knowledge to develop a successful wire mitigation strategy is possible for the West? And how can we better support the workforce that carries out wildland firefighting? And what role might a 21st century climate conservation corps play in training a new generation of forest managers?
So a couple of things. First, we certainly welcome more colleagues from the southeastern part of our wonderful country to join our caucus. So to the extent that I don't think we have a Georgia member of the caucus quite yet. So if you'd like to use your strong influence, Senator, with your colleagues from Georgia to encourage them to join the caucus, we'd be more than welcome. We'd welcome them into the fold, no doubt, and perhaps might have a thing or two to learn from them that they might be able to impart to us. I think that failure really isn't an option as far as sort of the West is concerned. As you said, we don't have fire seasons in Colorado anymore. I mean, they really are fire years. The fires that I mentioned last year, the historic, unprecedented wildfires that my community faced, those were still raging going into late November. We've had fires in December. We've had fires in January. And that, I think come as a shock to many folks who might not live in Colorado, who think that how could it possibly be that a state that's getting all that snowfall and is known for its, internationally for its winter sports, skiing and snowboarding and snowshoeing and so much more. How could you have fires still blazing in the dead of winter? But the reality is climate change has completely changed the calculus as far as wildfires are concerned, which means we have got to be strategic and serious, as I said, about planning for the future. And in my mind, it's why the Build Back Better plan that the president has announced and the investments that he has envisioned are so transformational, right? I mean, the bill, just to give you a sense of context, the Build Back Better bill includes $50 billion, $40 billion for Department of Agriculture and Department of Interior investments, project-based funding along the lines of what I've described, right? So the watershed work and the wildlife habitat preservation, the reducing of fuels in some cases, reforestation in other cases, following the science and letting the science dictate where we make those investments. And then $10 billion as a down payment on the Climate Conservation Corps. That is a huge, huge investment. I mean, $50 billion really would be kind of a once in a generation investment in our nation's forests. And we're very grateful that the president has stuck to that. Obviously, we're negotiating right now, as you both know, to see what pared down version of this bill we can get through both chambers of Congress, having a little more trouble in the upper chamber that you all served in, I guess, rather than the lower chamber of the House. But nonetheless, we will certainly get it done. And I think if those investments stick within the bill or something close to it, we will be able to, I think, address this in a long-term way along the lines of the way that you described it, Senator. Finally, the Climate Conservation Corps, the notion that you can sort of train up a new generation of forest managers by virtue of that program, I don't think is a fanciful notion. And to the extent anyone, disagrees, one could look no further than the AmeriCorps programs that exist within our respective states. We have a great program here in Colorado that is already doing some of this work. And oftentimes you'll have young folks working in those projects. I've visited with them, working on those projects rather, who will become forest managers of the future and have already done so. And really what we're talking about is just scaling up investments in those programs at the federal level so that every state can have a robust program along the lines of what Colorado has.
Congressman, we've been talking a lot about kind of the effects of climate change and building resiliency and protecting the forest and protecting our air quality. But there's another side of this coin, which is what the forests and what rangeland and agricultural land can do to mitigate and to get to net zero CO2 emissions. Can you talk a little bit about, kind of the vision of how your district and even places where we grow soybeans and corn in North Dakota can participate in reducing CO2 levels? And oh, by the way, I just want to say thank you for making Saxby and I feel really old by mentioning that you watched our careers when you were in law school, I think you said. So that's a demerit from 2 senators to a congressman. I'm just saying.
I meant it only in the most glowing terms. And I'm, relatively young congressman, so it wasn't that long ago that I was in law school. But no, I think that there's no question, right? Empirical data tells us that, and the research shows that growing forests absorb CO2, right? And clearly having healthy, intact forests, healthy grasslands plays a role in mitigating climate change. And it's one of the reasons why that $40 billion investment in our forests, coupled with the $10 billion in the Climate Conservation Corps, is so important, because there are a number of areas in our country and certainly in our state that require reforestation. At the same time, the reality is in the West, and of course, this, Senator, coming from the West, Midwest, West, sort of on the line there, that we have a complicated set of questions that arise as a result of mixed ownership of lands, right? You have a state like Colorado where we have 12 national forests. I mentioned 50% of the land in my district is federal public land, managed by the federal government. And yet a lot of the land that is in need or has, there's necessity for better management and addressing some of these reforestation and fuels challenges is privately owned, right? And it's not always clear, right? I mean, you literally will have parcels of land that go from federal to private to federal to private, trying to figure out ways to better collaborate amongst all of the partners in a community and create the right incentive structure to ultimately ensure that private landowners also are taking these steps is important. And it's, again, a big part of those investments that I mentioned within the bill. Final thing I'll mention, and perhaps this will compensate for the demerit that I rightfully received. Of course, Senator, you've been a great champion. You were a great champion during your time in Congress for regenerative agriculture. And I think that is a space where, number one, there's a lot we can accomplish together, right? And two, it's an area that crosses traditional partisan or political, philosophical lines, if you will. And I think it's another example of a place where we can make investments today that will pay off in the long run and have collateral benefits as well.
We have just one question coming in on the chat, and it's important because my colleague Saxby has mentioned this over and over again, that there's always one and done. And so what are your thoughts on how to shift our mindset from one-time investments to a long-term policy that gets us better private and public forest management to reduce the risk and to actually build out that resiliency? I mean, we're really concerned that everybody gets very excited about a bill like this, and then it's like, okay, the work is done. We're now out of the woods, so to speak. So how do you maintain the intensity that we all feel right now?
Yeah, it's a great question, and my experience has been that I find the most difficult case to make is to my colleagues who might not necessarily understand the scale or the severity of the crisis out west. And I say that, I mean, both of you come from states, obviously Georgia, which is rich in forests and has incredible national forests, and North Dakota, which again is in the Midwest West and has a lot of experience with the realities of federal land management and just all the nuances that are involved in that kind of relationship. Whereas many of my colleagues who are on the Eastern Seaboard just don't necessarily understand those nuances, or for that matter, the reality that once these fires come in, when our brave firefighters have gone in and have doused the flames, the impact, the collateral consequences of those fires stay with you and stay with us and stay with our state literally for years, close to a decade. The watershed protection work is a good example of this, right? Where we, just to give you an example, in August of this year, we had terrible, devastating flash floods that occurred on the burn scar from the historic wildfire that I mentioned that occurred in our district a year ago. Tragically, 3 people lost their lives. And I went up there to survey the damage with law enforcement. And while I was there, I mean, it was just breathtaking in scope in terms of just the damage that community sustained as a result of the flash flood. But literally, as we were, sort of looking at the damage and visiting with law enforcement and with community members who live there, I looked up and there was a helicopter aerial mulching a local reservoir, which has been happening every day for the better part of the last 3-4 months, and which will continue to protect the water supply for nearly 1 million people who live on our northern Front Range. So it gives you just a sense of, again, the scale and the reality that these problems are not going to go away. And so to the extent that the consequences of a historic wildfire are not felt on a one-time basis, the investments that we make shouldn't be one-time investments either. And that's really the argument that I've been making to my colleagues. And I think we're having certainly more success than we've had in the past in making the case, perhaps because our colleagues on the Eastern Seaboard, while they might not be experiencing the wildfires that we are experiencing in this visceral way, they also are experiencing the consequences of climate change in the form of record-breaking hurricanes that continue to wreak havoc on the eastern United States year after year after year. And the damage from Hurricane Sandy is still, they're still dealing with it years later as Hurricane Ida reaches its shores. So that it's a good corollary to what we're experiencing in the context of wildfires.
And what's interesting is you're also talking about the consequences that we're all paying for this. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We just have to get to that spot. I think any final notes, Saxby, before we turn to Quill?
A couple of things, Congressman, that Heidi and have been and I have been working on within this task force. One is the issue of private and public-private partnerships. So I'm really pleased to hear that you and Senator Bennett are working on something to create more and flexible policies that are available to private landowners that will be able to partner with the U.S. government and maybe allocate some of the resources in those partnerships. Secondly, we're always about trying to make sure that we're going to make some recommendations to you policymakers that will provide incentives to our farmers, our ranchers, and our forest landowners. And as within the caucus, if you think of issues or good policies that would be available for discussion, then Heidi and I are all ears about that. What we think is that we have a great opportunity here in America to address this issue of climate change by our farmers, ranchers, and forest landowners just doing what they're doing. They're doing today, and they're great stewards of conservation, and therefore are absorbing a lot of CO and carbon and some other emissions out there. So if you think of great ideas, we're all ears to it, and we would look forward to hear it from you.
Well, the same goes here, Senator, and door is always open. We would love to hear from both of you and your colleagues about ideas you might have to try to make some progress and move the needle on what is certainly going to be a defining issue for us out here in the West. So thank you both.
Thank you so much, Congressman. I think we're going to transition.
Yes, thank you. I am so pleased to introduce Quill Robinson. He is the Vice President of Government Affairs at the American Conservation Coalition. He is an alum of the University of Washington in Seattle and worked in Germany for a year as a fellow with the Congress Bundestag Youth Exchange for Young Professionals. Quill joined the American Conservation Coalition shortly after the organization was founded in 2017 with a mission of giving young conservatives a voice on environmental issues. He now oversees ACC's advocacy, policy, and coalitions work in Washington, D.C., working closely with lawmakers and leaders in the private and nonprofit sectors to develop and promote market-based environmental solutions. So welcome, Quill, and I will turn it back to our co-chairs to moderate the discussion.
Well, Quill, thanks for joining us today. And again, thanks for the great work you're doing here in your organization. managing, protecting, and conserving America's natural and working lands is emerging as a vital component of addressing climate change while providing economic benefits to rural communities. Now, would you kind of sort of talk through and give us the background of the American Conservation Coalition's Rooted in America campaign that you're focused on right now, and particularly on the role of natural carbon solutions within that?
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Senator. It's a privilege to be here, and I want to thank the Bipartisan Policy Center. They've been an incredible partner to the American Conservation Coalition, and really excited about the work that BPC is doing on natural climate solutions right now. So ACC, the organization I work for, was founded back in 2017 with this mission of giving young conservatives, young folks on the right of center, a voice on environmental issues, and really making sure that our elders were hearing our calls for pragmatic, effective, conservative solutions to issues like climate change. And so that's something that we spent a lot of time sitting down with Republican lawmakers, thought leaders, communicating our desire for conservative leadership on these sorts of issues. And I think we've seen a lot of progress on that. Here in 2021, we have the Conservative Climate Caucus, which is the third largest caucus in the United States Congress. Leader McCarthy has unveiled a climate plan, and you're really seeing a lot of Republicans engaged on this issue of climate change. And so that's a really exciting thing for us at ACC, and something that we've been really proud to be part of. In terms of natural climate solutions, as I said, we're really focused on market-based mechanisms, climate mechanisms that empower local communities, climate mechanisms that speak to rural communities that are often left out of these conversations about climate change. And so this fall, we decided to really focus our efforts on natural climate solutions. And so obviously a lot of the conversations around climate have to do with energy and transportation, and rightly so. But I think that kind of one of the areas of climate policy that is often undercovered but is really, really exciting is natural climate solutions. And so, what does that mean? That's basically conservation and restoration practices that enhance ecosystems' ability to sequester more carbon dioxide, but also create more resiliency. Now, that's a little bit wonky, but we've been working with this campaign, Rooted in America campaign, to reach young people and talk to them about the power of natural climate solutions. And the statistic that I always go back to here that's just so exciting to me is the fact that we can reach about 37% of our mitigation goals by 2030 through natural climate solutions. That was a statistic from the National Academy of Sciences. So, this is not a small portion of the mitigation steps that we need to take. Not only that, so it's scientifically based, but not only that, it has this incredible bipartisan potential. And that's something that's also very exciting and important to us at ACC. I think that, in the conversations that we're having with conservatives around the country, often folks in rural areas feel pretty left out of the climate conversation, like they'll be victimized or on the wrong end of climate policy. But I think the really powerful thing about natural climate solutions, for example, planting more trees, using no-till or cover crops, restoring grasslands and wetlands, is that this actually puts folks in more rural and often more conservative areas into the driver's seat rather than making them the victims of climate policy. So I think that's a really powerful thing. And just to give you a sense of how this is resonating with our demographic, 18 to 35-year-olds around the country, we're already, I think we blew through 2.5 million impressions with the hashtag on Twitter. We've held a dozen local conservation action events where our activists are out there planting trees and visiting sustainable farms. And I think that this kind of common sense set of solutions to climate change is really resonating with young people. So as partisan and divisive as the conversation here in DC is right now, I think that natural climate solutions have incredible scientific, but also bipartisan political potential when it comes to addressing this really important issue of climate change.
Yeah, Quill, there's nothing like getting 2,000 or 2 million or 3 million people to express their desire to get Congress's attention, because they're all voters. And obviously we are thrilled that you're operating in this space, that you see this potential. My question is, how do we move Congress? I mean, typically it is the more conservative element that is more resistant. In fact, frequently climate deniers. How can your group kind of get people into the space that we need to do something about this, and here's some solutions. How open are the Congress people and the senators that you guys have been talking to listen to your wishes and to listen to the 2 million, 3 million young people who say we need to do something?
Well, Senator Heitkamp, I think that I see a lot more Republicans leaning in on this issue, even in the last year. And that's really encouraging to me. And I think that's in no small part due to the fact that, younger conservatives and future leaders of the Republican Party have said, look, there's a conservative way to address this serious issue. Doesn't mean you have to go for the Green New Deal, but we got to address this issue and we got to do it in a pragmatic way. I think that, I'm actually already seeing evidence that Congress is interested and is moving on this issue. I'd reference the Growing Climate Solutions Act, which just passed the Senate 92-8 over the summer, which is pretty unusual. I can't think of a lot of things that you'd get near unanimity in the Senate on these days, but this Growing Climate Solutions Act, which essentially will make it easier for farmers, foresters, ranchers to participate in voluntary carbon markets, passed 92-8. It was truly a bipartisan effort. Now we're just waiting on getting it through the House. But I think that's just one example of the types of solutions that have authentic bipartisan appeal. And if we can separate them from a lot of the political fighting and say, look, this is just a common sense solution that we can work together on and get through, I think there's a lot of potential there. And when it comes to planting more trees, that poll is pretty high as well. There was a Pew poll last year that found that 90% of Americans support planting about 1 trillion trees to address climate change. And so I think, both among the American public, but also in Congress, there's really overwhelming bipartisan support when it comes to natural climate solutions in a way that there is on very few other issues.
One issue that I know is very important to your coalition, which is the issue of being able to take advantage of social media. And if you're going to have that, if you're going to attract young folks to the rural parts of America, they're going to have to be able to access broadband and all the attractive apps and equipment that young folks particularly utilize these days. And when I sit here today in Atlanta, I've got great infrastructure relative to whatever telecommunications equipment may be needed. But in rural parts of my state, and certainly more so in Heidi's state, as well as other parts of the West, the infrastructure is lacking. And that is real. It's a real issue, not only with the attracting of young folks to rural America, but on the issue, the practicality of wildfires and how we're going to communicate relative from firefighter to firefighter. If they can't be able to talk to each other about what's going on in their area while they're fighting a fire, then they're handicapped. So I do know that the current infrastructure bill that is being debated in Congress today has a number of policies and a lot of resource giving the issue of broadband in rural America a real pumped up. So I know your folks are excited about that. I hope they are, and I hope they're talking to their members of Congress about that. Is that an issue that comes up often with your folks?
Well, Senator, I think, yeah, I mean, rural broadband for a whole host of different reasons is an incredibly important issue. Obviously, as to attract young farmers, I don't know, maybe they shouldn't be going on TikTok, but they want to have access to some of the other apps and make sure that they can have that lifestyle living out in the country. But I'd also point out when it comes to precision agriculture and being able to use technology to use resources in a more efficient way, whether that's water or fertilizer or determining where to plant particular crops, rural broadband is incredibly important for that as well. And so I think this really is a no-brainer. Obviously, we need to figure out the right balance between public-private partnerships and how to set up the incentives in the proper way to get rural broadband out to the places that it's needed. The other thing I'll say about young folks when it comes to the agricultural industry is that obviously, a lot of young folks are leaving rural areas and continuing to head into more urban areas, into the cities. But something that I've actually heard with some of the farmers that we're working with is that as they're trying to attract more young people into these more rural communities to be farmers, to work on farms, that incorporating that element of farmers in the agricultural industry being on the leading edge of addressing this important issue of climate change is actually something that's really appealing to young people. That not only do a lot of young folks are out there protesting about climate change, sure, but by working in the agricultural industry, by being a farmer who is using no-till or precision agriculture or cover crops, and actually being on the front lines of climate solutions, that's a really exciting thing to young farmers, and it's another way that they can attract those younger people into those rural communities to do those super important jobs.
I couldn't agree with you more. I remember I was sitting with an FFA group and a young man kind of had his cap pulled over his head. And I started talking about soil health, and this young man lit up the room. So excited. He had been working with a farmer in Oaks, North Dakota to restore his soil. And this is a kid who you knew loved agriculture, but loved being on the right side of this issue and on the right side of soil conservation. I think there's going to be a lot of people who may be a little more cynical about your group. And so want to better understand, has your group set any climate goals? Like, reducing emissions by so much by this period of time, and then looked at strategies. Other than kind of saying, here's a great opportunity to work in a public-private partnership, has your group basically said, this is an emergency that we need to address, and here's where we think we can be in, let's say, 30 years?
Sure. Well, Senator Heitkamp, I think, we were created to fulfill a particular need, and we listened to young people around us, and we heard a lot of fear, terror, anger, frustration on this issue of climate change. And there's a statistic that I saw just last month that really sticks in my mind. 46% of young Americans think that humanity is doomed because of climate change. And that makes me really sad, because I think that fear is not an empowering thing. It's a disempowering thing. And so our organization, ACC, was founded, although we're grounded in conservative principles, to really focus on tangible, pragmatic steps when it comes to issues like climate change. And so, in terms of overall goals, we support generally moving towards, global net zero by 2050. Obviously, there's a lot of ways to get there, but I really think our strength as an organization is actually the fact that we've been passing bills and doing local conservation action that's actually moving us towards that goal rather than just talking about it. Our activists, they're absolutely incredible, sent hundreds and hundreds of emails to get the Energy Act of 2020 passed, with all that battery storage and carbon capture and small modular reactor funding that was in that bill. They were also instrumental in helping get the Growing Climate Solutions Act across the finish line in the Senate. And around this campaign right now, Rooted in America, our activists have already planted dozens and dozens of trees across the country, which it may seem like a small fish, but each one of those trees will sequester a ton of carbon dioxide over its lifetime. And so, I think that there is certainly a role for organizations to highlight the emergency around climate change, but we're focused on empowering people and making sure that they can actually feel like they are taking real steps forward, and that they can actually be part of the progress rather than just the fear and anguish around climate change. And I do think that is badly missing right now. This kind of focus on activism, whereas we are focused more on action and things that will actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions and make young people feel like they are part of the solution.
Before I turn it over to Saxby, I just want to mention to the audience, you can put a question before us and we will try and relay it to Quill. We don't want this just to be me and Saxby, although we're intrigued by all of this and so grateful for the work that's being done by so many. So I'll turn it back to Saxby and encourage you to submit your questions.
Yeah, I want to go back to the issue of the bill that you referenced that passed in the Senate by 92-8. You know, agriculture was kind of late coming to the table on the issue of climate change, but our farmers, our ranchers, and our forest landowners have the opportunity to reap so many benefits from the right kind of policies that might come out of Congress. And the benefits will be generated for doing nothing different than what they do today. More growing of trees, more cover crops, those types of things, as you say, are going to sequester many different types of greenhouse gases. But we're all about incentives, as we talked earlier in the earlier part of this podcast, and what we're hopeful are that with the recognition by the Senate Agriculture and now the full Senate, that there are capabilities from a policy standpoint to creating markets, and those markets will be, if they have the right type of policies and incentives, those markets will be very active, and there will be additional income of streams of income for all of our farmers and ranchers and forest landowners. So I really am glad to hear that your folks, number one, are paying attention to what's going on in Washington relative to the policies on this issue, and that you're engaged on the issue, and hopefully you're carrying that enthusiasm to your enthusiasm to Capitol Hill as you're moving forward also here.
I guess, you know, as somebody who is with the Growing Climate Solutions, a big proponent, and you obviously great help in the Senate, what's your hope that it's going to pass in the House of Representatives? And what are you guys doing that people who are watching this could help you with? Here's your pitch to get some more folks in your army that's going to help move that bill in particular forward. Quill.
Absolutely. Well, I think that, you know, just to emphasize what this bill is, it isn't, you know, some big, expansive, complicated program. It simply makes it easier for, you know, the companies and individuals out there that want to pay for carbon credits to pay those farmers, forest landowners, and ranchers who can deliver those carbon credits. And I think that's one of the big opportunities in climate policy right now, is that, you know, many corporations have made massive commitments in terms of their climate goals and are willing to pay the folks, you know, who can deliver that carbon sequestration a lot of money to do that. And that's essentially what that bill does. It helps match up the supply and the demand here and make that market work even better. And so personally, I think it's a no-brainer. Our activists think it's a no-brainer. It's truly a market-based policy. And, you know, right now we're waiting to hear from the House Agricultural Committee. They're going to have a markup on this bill soon. And I think, you know, what's really important here is, you know, our activists in particular are going to be talking a lot to the Republicans on that committee and say, look, you know, we're looking for you to step up on this and get this one through. And I think that, you know, other environmental activists should do the same. You know, if you're on the Democratic side of things, make sure to talk to the Democratic members. But I think this is a really unique opportunity for a truly bipartisan win on climate change. I'm not saying it's going to solve climate change, but it's going to move us in the right direction. That can set a good precedent, right? I think this infrastructure conversation has been really polarizing, and the American people are pretty frustrated and confused, whichever side you fall on. But with the Growing Climate Solutions Act, we have a real opportunity to set a precedent for more bipartisan, sustainable, effective, long-term climate policy. And ultimately, we need that, right? We can't be flip-flopping back and forth from administration to administration for the next, the next 30, 40 years. And so I think this is a must.
And I think the real benefit is that it is an acknowledgement that this is a public policy issue that needs to be addressed. And so I think your participation, and certainly coming from your side of the political discussion, is so invaluable. And I want to thank you and your team for everything that you're doing to advance solutions to this problem.
Thank you, Senator Heitkamp.
Likewise, Quill, and we're very proud of you for stepping up on this issue, and just keep doing what you're doing.
Absolutely.
Leslie, we're going to flip it back to you.
All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We will invite you to please go to our website to find out more about what BPC's Farm and Forest Carbon Solutions Task Force is up to. We have our policy statement available there for download, and we'll be seeing you very soon. Thanks again for joining.